Edwin will introduce himself through his words, and let's put our hands together to welcome Edwin Tang.
Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters. Once again, good evening. In 1986, right after the tragedy of the Space Shuttle Challenger that had exploded minutes after takeoff, the next day President Reagan, at the time, he addressed the nation. And in the last line of his speech, he said, "We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, as they prepared for their mission and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." That line turned out to be one of the most well-remembered lines in any presidential speech in history. And it became one of my favorite lines. I felt it was so powerful and poetic at the same time. And it led me eventually to really admire President Ronald Reagan for that line. And I remember thinking, wow, what a deep soul, what an incredibly deep person he must be to have written that line. And of course, President Reagan became one of my idols growing up as a child in the 80s. And then I became an adult, and I found out that President Reagan didn't actually write that line. He borrowed that line from someplace else, and I was shocked. I was like, no, you're kidding me. This was one of the cornerstones of my childhood, and you're telling me that he didn't say this. So I started to get really curious. Where did that line come from? Where did that line come from? In 1941, during World War II, Nazi Germany had pretty much taken over most of Europe. Only Great Britain was left standing, and they were fighting to remain free. And America at the time was struggling to remain neutral. However, many Americans felt that this was morally wrong, that America really should be part of the effort to stop the Nazis from taking over. And some Americans felt so passionate about the war and the conflict that they snuck across the border into Canada and enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force to join the war. One such American was a man named John Gillespie McGee Jr. He was only 18 years old. He was an only child of poor Irish immigrants, and his parents basically worked and toiled all their lives so that young John may have a chance for a better life in this country. He was only 18 years old at the time, and of course, when he enlisted in the Canadian Air Force, his parents were strongly opposed. He was their only child, and all their hopes and dreams were with John. But John felt really strongly about it, and they could do nothing to stop him. So in about a year of military training in Canada, John and his squadron was sent over to Great Britain immediately to provide air defense for Great Britain against the invading German forces. Well, they successfully fended off the Germans, and in a few months after he went over to Great Britain, the Allies were starting to plan to take back France from the Germans. And his squadron was sent over to provide air cover for the Allied ground forces entering Normandy and other parts of France. Now, in his first mission into France, he was shot down by German anti-aircraft. And in the inquiry, the ground forces that survived testified that they saw John's plane fall from the sky and that he was struggling in his cockpit to get it open. But by the time that he opened his cockpit and ejected, he was already too close to the ground for his parachute to open. And he died instantly. He was only 19 years old. Now, throughout this time, his parents really had no communication with him. So the only way his parents found out about his tragic death was through a letter an official letter that was sent to him, and it read as follows. Dear Mr. and Mrs. McGee, I've been shown in the files of the 7th Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force a statement from Commander Matthew Wallace that you are the parents of Pilot Officer John Gillespie McGee, Jr., who died gloriously in the field of battle. Your son's funeral took place at Scopwick Cemetery near Digby Aerodrome at 2:30 p.m. on Sunday, December 13th, 1941. The service being conducted by Flight Lieutenant S.K. Belton, the Canadian Padre of the station. He was accorded full service honors, the coffin being carried by pilots of his own squadron. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine, and what attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the free nations he died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the love lost and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid down so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, James K. Worthington, General of British and Canadian Allied Forces, December 28, 1941. So this was the official letter that his parents received. And one can only imagine what his parents must have felt upon reading this. There was also a second letter that they sent to his parents. This was the letter they found in his barracks that was written by John himself, which he had intended to mail out to his parents after he returned from his mission. But of course he never returned from his mission. This is what John wrote to his parents. Dear Mom and Dad, sorry I haven't written sooner, but it is hard to find even a few hours to myself with all the fighting going on. We have succeeded in pushing back Hitler's forces from the southern coast of England. My squadron will be flying into France to support Allied ground troops invading Normandy next week. I miss you, and I promise to return safely to see you again. The other day, while at 30,000 feet, en route to one of my checkpoints, I was struck with inspiration for a poem. I started it, and then finished it soon after I landed. I've written the complete verse on the back of this letter for you. Take care, and I will write again soon. Your son, John, December 3rd, 1941. High flight. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth, and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed, and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung, high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along, and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious burning blue. I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark or ever eagle flew. And, while with silent lifting mind, I've trod the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand, and touched the face of God. Mr. Tabletop.